Steve Kretzmann, you're director of Oilchange International, so you've been tracking the global oil industry and oil money for years. So can you tell us how exactly has the global oil industry helped to prevent a legally binding treaty on climate change?
Well, it's interesting because it's not immediately obvious. You don't actually see the oil industry here at the climate talks because they've done all their homework back in the capitals by lining up the government positions before they even get here. The most obvious is the way that a country like Saudi Arabia behaves here, where they have really time and again blocked rules of procedure and other things that would actually make it possible for the convention to be successful over the long term. But you also have the tremendous interest that the oil industry exerts over countries like the United States, where there's millions and millions of dollars spent on lobbying and campaign finance every year that unfortunately really ends up warping the position of the U.S. government over time.
So what's the role of subsidies, climate harmful subsidies in that context?
Well, so this money goes into the system, particularly in the United States. We see campaign finance, lobbying money, et cetera, and what comes out on the other side is subsidies. It's benefit for the oil industry and the coal industry that really, so for instance, in the U.S., there's about $40 billion a year that goes out from the U.S. Treasury to the oil and coal industry on an annual basis. And this is obviously a shockingly high figure. Throughout the U.S. and North America, Europe, and other sort of Annex 1 countries, as we call them, developed countries, there is at least $100 billion annually that goes to polluting industries, and it's a huge figure, and it actually dwarfs the spending on, for instance, fast start finance that is here in the climate change negotiations, or the public spending that's even going into clean energy and renewables. So this is a really key issue when you're still funding the problem more than you are the solution. It's no real surprise that we can't actually solve the problem. We need to find a way to arrange the financial incentives in a way that will actually get us to the solution that we all want, which is, a transition to clean energy, and that's the first and we think most obvious thing to do is to stop throwing our taxpayer dollars, all of our taxpayer dollars, after the oil industry and the coal industry, because they certainly don't need it. These are some of the most profitable industries on the planet, and yet they continue to receive it at very high levels.
Yeah, and so the G20 have pledged to reduce these subsidies. Have they done their homework?
Not really, unfortunately. I mean, I think we were all very happy last year when the G20 in Pittsburgh announced that they were going to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, and we thought, oh, well, that's great, wonderful, let's see how that goes. Unfortunately, we've just done an analysis of what has happened as a result of that pledge, and the reality is no subsidies have actually been phased out. There are some subsidies that people are talking about phasing out that they were talking about before the Pittsburgh commitment was made, but that actually haven't even been, the phase out hasn't been achieved. So it's really disturbing, and we haven't actually seen the G20 step up and fulfill the leadership role that they say they want to do by pointing the subsidies in the right direction and stopping to point them in the wrong direction. Instead, we've seen a lot of reporting, honestly, that is just sort of really, it's really greenwash, right? It just ends up saying, oh, look at all the wonderful things we're doing, but really is just spin. It doesn't actually, they're not actually phasing out subsidies, and they're just talking about it. The good news is they say they want to do it, and there's a lot of international political support for doing it, and people generally recognize that it's a good thing to do, but actually getting from it's a good idea to doing it seems to be a little bit harder than we thought it might be.
Okay. This debate is not really taking place here in Cancun, so is there any message you'd like to see coming out of Cancun? Was that from anyone?
Well, one thing we would really like to see, frankly, is the Obama administration standing up and speaking quite truthfully about what's going on, because the story that most people read here is, in media around the world, is it's developed countries versus developing nations, and there's a standstill, and we have this terrible problem because of this divide in between rich and poor. That's not the story. The story is that fossil fuel interests who are really controlling a lot of the Republican Party in the United States are holding the U.S. hostage, and thus the U.S. isn't able to put any commitments on the table. And it would be really nice, frankly, if the Obama administration, rather than blaming China and India and others for inaction, were to stand up and say, we actually would like to go much further, which is, of course, what many of their materials and campaign positions originally said, but we can't because of the Republicans and the fossil fuel interests in our government. That way, maybe the story that we're coming out would be more accurate, which is the Republicans and the fossil fuel interests are the ones that are really holding up progress here internationally, and people would see that the problem is not rich versus poor, north versus south, but, you know, us versus the oil industry and the moneyed interests that continue to want to profit off of climate change.
Thanks for joining us at Cancun Convention Center today.
Thanks very much.